Seems that the conflict in Ukraine has escalated to near dire situations, which could mean a potential global catastrophe. And what I want to do today is show similarities between what is happening now and what happened in 1979 in Afghanistan. Because what I'm seeing currently, right now, with the conflict in Ukraine, is what I have learned about what happened when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Now, one thing is for certain is that there are no actual winners or clean hands in regards to that conflict in Afghanistan and this conflict here in Ukraine. And what I want to do is try and give a more clearer picture on the similarities of both. Now, last night, in which I'll be reading from uh, news articles and showing you videos which are going to uh, help you, the viewer, see a really dual similarity between both conflicts. And so, what I'm reading for you right now is an article dated just this morning by CNN, in which it says, in a major blow for Russian President Vladimir Putin, a huge explosion has severely damaged the only bridge connecting the annexed Crimean peninsula with the Russian mainland, paralyzing a key supply route for Moscow's faltering war in Ukraine. The blast early Saturday caused parts of the Kerch Strait Road and rail bridge, opened by Putin himself in 2018, to collapse. Images and video from the scene showed at least 3 people were killed in the explosion, Russian officials said, citing preliminary information. The exact cause of the blast at Europe's longest bridge is yet to be confirmed. Russian officials said a truck exploded, causing Crimea-bound sections of the bridge road portion to collapse. A subsequent fire engulfed a train of fuel tanks on a separate adjacent rail portion of the bridge. Just like Afghanistan 1979, Ukraine also saw an instigator that caused this conflict. And one of the problems that are facing the Ukrainian civilians are basically instigated by the United States and NATO. Now, with Afghanistan, NATO was not involved, but the United States basically became involved when they found that the Soviets themselves had a communist influence in the Afghanistan government that went back decades. And when the Soviets invaded Kabul, the United States got involved right away and sent National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski to speak on behalf of the State Department in defense of the Mujahideen.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
او تاسو جماعتونه او تاسو کورونا بدل تاسو شي ولې چې تاسو په حق روانه
And that's just the beginning of a 10-year conflict, which saw casualties on both sides, billions of dollars coming in, not just from the United States, but also from Saudi sympathizers, which helped bring about these radical fundamentalists, which were growing at the time with Saudi money, Gulf money, which helped to create radical, ultra-orthodox terrorist groups like Al Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf, and Jemaah Islamiyah, and later on, Islamic State and Levant. But what did those groups cause? While the United States and Saudi Arabia and Great Britain and Pakistan and the CIA and Israel gave billions to a CIA operation called Operation Cyclone. The training that the Pakistan ISI, the intelligence service, were training these Salafi groups, which made up 10% of the fighting force in Afghanistan, as the Afghans basically did not like the Arabs, the foreign Arabs, to be involved in a war that basically was just involving them. And after that conflict, we saw a lot of these groups that were trained and given all this money in the conflict, and they went back to their home countries and started proxy wars and acts of terrorism in countries like the United States, Philippines, Indonesia, and later Great Britain, the United Kingdom, France, Germany. And all of this was just a ripple effect of the the United States insistence in quelling a bigger enemy, which was at the time the Soviet Union. Now, the blowback to all this is basically what the CIA did, as well as the foreign intelligence services did in creating another monster in return. In 2015, the Daily Beast wrote an article called "Is America Training Neo-Nazis in Ukraine?" And in this article, in which I will share with you and we'll read together, we could see that in the article it states, in an interview with the Daily Beast, Sergeant Ivan Kharkiv of the Azov Battalion talks about his battalion's experience with U.S. trainers and U.S. volunteers quite fondly, even mentioning U.S. volunteers, engineers, and medics that are still currently assisting them. He also talks about the significant and active support from the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. As for the training they have and continue to receive from numerous foreign armed forces, Kharkiv says, we must take knowledge from all armies. We pay for our mistakes with our lives. Those U.S. officials involved in the vetting process obviously have instructions to say that U.S. forces are not training the Azov battalion as such. They also say that Azov members are screened out, yet no one seems to know precisely how that's done. In fact, given the way the Ukrainian government operates, it's almost impossible. And later on, later down in the article, the Daily Beast interviewed State Department Representative Press Officer Yarina Ferestiev of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, in which Ferestiev told Daily Beast, quote, "At this point, as far as we are aware, no, there is no members of Azov. Whether or not some may be in the lineup, that is possible. But frankly, our vetting screens for human rights violations, not for ideology. Neo-Nazis, can join the U.S. Army too. The battalions that are in question have been integrated as part of Ukraine's National Guard. And so the idea is that they would be eligible for training, but in all honesty, I cannot tell you if there are any on the list we trained. They were not in the final rotation as far as I'm aware, end quote. In regards to the United States as being an instigator with the conflict in Ukraine, need I remind you about certain people from the State Department who got involved as far back as 2014. Here we see Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham talk to Ukrainian battalion.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже, щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Я вірю в те, що ви виграєте, переможете. Я переконаний в тому, що ви переможете, і ми вам допоможемо всіма можливими засобами.
Це те ж саме гільзи з ворожих БМП, які розмальовані художництвом радянська.
So how did the U.S. get involved with what we are seeing today? In 2014, in February, there was a large-scale protest called the Revolution of Dignity. Now, in November of 2013, large protests erupted in response to President Viktor Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, and instead chose closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. And these protests were called the Euromaidan. But 3 months later, the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly approved finalizing the agreement with the European Union, in which Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject it. Now, these protests did continue for a couple months, and the protests were basically not violent, so to speak. They did turn out tens of thousands of people, in which the calls for the resignation of Viktor Yanukovych and the Azarov government. The Azarov government was Ukraine's government from December 2012 to January 2014, in which it was dissolved during the Euromaidan protests. Prime Minister Mykola Azarov replaced Deputy Prime Minister Sergei Abrazov. And basically, the protests opposed what they saw as government corruption, abuse of power through the influence of oligarchs. But what happened was the United States basically were handing out propaganda leaflets and instigating through the use of the CIA to force the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, who basically was elected president through a fair and democratic election, in which, after the Euromaidan protests in February 14, I want to say specifically February 18th of 2014, clashes in the capital, Kiev, between the Berkut Special Force Riot Police of the Ukrainian military resulted in the deaths of 108 protesters and 13 police officers. Many of the protesters involved with this protest, which is the Revolution of Dignity, were coming from ultra right-wing separatists, those same separatists that were given training by the CIA in that Daily Beast article I had shared with you. Now, what I want to share with you also as well is a phone call that happened between Victoria Nuland, who is the top U.S. diplomat for Europe, and Jeff Pyatt, the U.S. envoy to Kiev, in which they were discussing the merits of various opposition figures in the Revolution of Dignity. During the call, Nuland is heard using a crude phrase in regards to European Union, which was working with the U.S. on a political resolution with the ouster of Viktor Yushchenko. And what I want to do is I want to play the whole phone call with you, which is showing that there was indeed a massive influence regarding the U.S. government's interest in forcing out Viktor Yanukovych and having an interim government and hopefully a president that is basically pro-Western, a government just like what we saw in Afghanistan when the Soviets pulled out of their war due to U.S. interference in that conflict as well. And so let's listen to that phone call right now.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, you know, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. Klitschko has been the top dog. He's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. Mm-hmm. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So
okay.
Biden's willing.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And there you have it. And so with that, in 2014 came the it came on at the heels of the revolution that we saw in the force and the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych said that the vote with the in which Yanukovych was actually forced out by these ultra right-wing separatists and snipers that were shooting at police officers. Even as this was going on, in February 21st of 2014, an agreement between Viktor Yanukovych and the leaders of the paramilitary opposition was signed and called for the formation of an interim unity government to try and save the country from falling into a civil war. The following day, the police actually withdrew from Kiev, and which came under effective control of the protesters and the right-wing separatists, and Yanukovych had to flee the city. On that day, when the protesters broke into parliament, Yanukovych fled. The right-wing separatists basically forced the ouster of Yanukovych, and the parliament of the opposition groups voted to remove Yanukovych from office in a vote of 328-0, in which Yanukovych would later say that the vote was illegal and coerced, and even asked Russia to help. Now, of course, what we just witnessed was a coup, and Russian government basically went on TV and said that the overthrow of Yanukovych was an illegal coup and did not recognize the interim government. That's exactly right. So this protest basically broke out for a week, and then what we saw immediately afterwards was the early phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which escalated into Russian military intervention, just like what we saw in Afghanistan in 1979, when we had communist influences under presidents like Barbara Kemal, Hafizullah Amin, which saw the slaughter and genocide of native Pashtuns and these religious farmers that basically didn't adhere to these nationalist creeds that they tried to civilize or I'll use that term, civilize these smaller towns and cities of northern Afghanistan. And so we saw the military under these communist influences, these presidents, basically Mohammed Nur and Hafizullah Amin and Kamal and all these leaders, these presidents, basically saw the killing of tens of thousands of people, and torture and brutality that basically brought the Russian government in and basically force these communist influences out of the country, in which the Muslims, the Islamic call for unity to get the communist bloc out of the country finally, in which the United States helped to instigate at the same time. Now, with the after these protests called the Revolution Dignity, we saw the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the creation of self-proclaimed breakaway states in Donetsk and Luhansk, which was the disputed territories. This sparked the Donbass War and culminated with Russia initiating a full-scale invasion of the country, just like it did in Afghanistan in 1979 in 2022. And just like what we saw in Afghanistan, is what we're seeing right now in the capital Kiev, in Donbass, in Luhansk. And it was just like Afghanistan 1979. Just like this.
The Soviet Union felt like they were very much more powerful in the 70s because of our failure in Vietnam and the conversion of many countries to communism, and they felt like they were on the march, they were on the move.
This is the third occasion since World War II that the Soviet Union has moved militarily to assert control over one of its neighbors.
For the first time, Jimmy Carter admitted that he finally realized what the Soviet Union was all about. Well, the Americans were not quite sure what to do with regard to Afghanistan. There was concern that the country is so impossible to manage and govern, even by the Afghanis, and nobody else has ever really won the war there.
The anti-government rebels call themselves the Mujahideen.
My dad was supporting Mujahideen, and he was never happy for the Russians to come to Afghanistan and occupy my country. My uncles from both sides, from my mother's side and from my dad's side, were fighting against Russians. They were in the Mujahideen forces.
Do you think that the Mujahideen alone can get the Soviet army out of Afghanistan and topple the government?
Really, it is a difficult job. Really, it's not easy. Afghanistan people, they are very poor and they have not enough arms against these modern weapons of Russia. But the people in other countries, they could support the Mujahideen, provide them arms, weapons, money, food, clothes, medicine, anything.
The Mujahideen are alarmed by Soviet occupation of other Muslim nations.
We've seen what happened in, Central Asian republics. Now, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all the other republics.
They're going to need millions of dollars worth of arms to fight the Soviet army. The U.S. goes public with its fight against the communist Afghan government.
They figured, we're not going to go in there and let it become a graveyard for our people. The Soviets are in there, they've already made the commitment, so let's just funnel aid to the Northern Alliance and then to the broader group called the Mujahideen, and just make the Soviets pay the price for kind of going into the wrong place at the wrong time.
And so that's exactly what we're seeing today, with the United States basically sending billions of dollars in aid to Ukrainian separatists and the military, which is going to create these smaller ultra-nationalist groups into something much larger. because we're sending much more money in this conflict than we did in Operation Cyclone. And I think at this point, and I don't want to misquote Dave DeCamp from the Libertarian Institute, I think we're up to over $71 billion in aid. Don't quote me on that number. It's in that ballpark. And, you know, 5 months ago, you had President Biden basically giving $33 billion in additional aid on top of it.
In the past 2 months, Russia launched its brutal attack and has moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine. We've moved weapons and equipment to Ukraine in record speed. Thanks to the aid we provided, Russian forces have been forced to retreat from Kyiv. Doesn't mean they're not going to try to come back, but they've retreated thus far. We've sent thousands of anti-armor, anti-missiles, helicopters, drones, grenade launchers, machine guns, rifles, radar systems, more than 50 million rounds of ammunition. The United States alone has provided 10 anti-armor systems for every Russian tank that is in Ukraine, 10 to 1. We're providing Ukraine significant, timely intelligence to help them defend themselves against the Russian onslaught. And we're facilitating a significant flow of weapons and systems to Ukraine from our allies and partners around the world, including tanks, artillery, and other weapons. That support is moving with unprecedented speed. Much of the new equipment we've announced in the past 2 weeks has already gotten to Ukraine, where it can be put to direct use on the battlefield. However,
and why is the United States doing this? Why is the United States helping Ukraine? Is it because we believe in democratically elected governments trying to defend themselves from corrupt regimes? Well, if that's the case, why are we sending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to one of the most corrupt nations on the face of the earth to engage in a genocide, which is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, Saudi Arabia, in their war against Yemen? We send millions of dollars in military aid and also to financial aid to a country that is engaging in human rights violations for the past 50, 60 years in Israel against the Palestinians. Meanwhile, we have left pundits like Alexander Vindman saying, I'm dreaming of this moment. Vindman, who's a best-selling author and a former White House staffer, saying things like this. And we're getting a lot of these left wings. Now, don't call them liberals because they're not. These people are basically neocons. They just swerve from party to party because they only serve their interests. There is no left and right when it comes to the greater geopolitical issues. There's only a left and right when it comes to you, the American people, to keep you divided. Now, most Americans are very ignorant regarding the exogenesis of the Ukraine conflict. And in a way, it's not partially all their fault because we have a legacy media that is basically nothing more than propaganda mills that run psychological operations. Now, I did a great talk with my good friend Patrick McFarland of Liberty Weekly, and where we talked about how the U.S. military engages in psychological operations using the media as the outlet to manipulate the thinking of Americans. Isn't that what we see here with Ukraine conflict? Isn't that what we see from right-wing pundits regarding China and Iran? And also, just like what we saw in Afghanistan, the United States has been involved with Ukraine that goes back many decades, not as far back as Afghanistan, but with Ukraine, it's basically due to the United States supporting a radical nationalist influence that committed egregious war crimes. Now, I did a fantastic podcast talk with Richard Cox, my co-host of the Darkened Hour, and one of our most popular episodes is not regarding 9/11, but about how the CIA became involved with Ukrainian nationalists like Mykola Lebed and Stephen Banderas that go back to the age of the Cold War, in which Mykola Lebed, who was somebody who engaged in the slaughter of tens of thousands of Polish Jews in World War II, and also was involved with the assassination of Polish Prime Minister in 1934. And who basically let him out of jail? The Nazis, when they invaded Poland. And who gave him a job to spy on Soviet influences in Eastern Europe and here in the United States? The CIA. And that operation was called Operation Aerodynamic. There is an annual training exercise that happens in Ukraine involving the US military that goes back to 1992. Army gears up for rapid Trident exercise in Ukraine. Roughly 300 US soldiers will join approximately 6,000 troops from 12 nations participating in an annual multinational training exercise in Ukraine later this month. Rapid Trident 21 will take place from September 20th through October 1st and will prepare personnel from allied and partner nations for crisis response, according to a news release from U.S. Army Europe and Africa Command. Last year's exercise only involved 4,100 personnel. Soldiers from the Washington Army National Guard's 81st Stryker Brigade combat team has been deployed in support of the Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine since April. The exercise is the final phase of a longer annual training exercise which seeks to help prepare Ukraine land forces for real-world defense challenges. And this exercise has been going on since the early 1990s. And that article was dated 2021. And this has been its 26th year in existence. So it's not like that all of a sudden we're seeing, the United States get involved because Russia basically invaded these separatist, these disputed territories. I have shown you documentation of why the U.S. got involved. And I'm hoping this will bring clarity and understanding to that I'm not defending Russia because they're a murderous regime under Putin. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the United States certainly isn't doing this in the best interest of Ukraine. In fact, they've instigated this conflict in the hopes of gaining a new enemy, because we no longer have an Arab terrorism enemy anymore. With the assassination of bin Laden in 2011, with the assassination of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, which happened multiple times, it seems, just this year, with most of the al-Qaeda hierarchy either dead or in Guantanamo Bay, al-Qaeda poses no threat internationally. And most of these Wahhabi, Saudi, CIA-backed organizations no longer are a threat internationally. Al-Qaeda is a threat in the Arabian Peninsula, and their affiliates like Boko Haram in North Africa, as well as the Islamic State and their elements in North Africa and Iraq, they're still around, but they don't pose a threat internationally. Well, in steps in an old enemy, Russia. And how do we get Russia into play? And how do we fundamentally bring Russia back into the fold as an enemy? By instigating a conflict. In 2022, Zach Dorfman, who was a national security correspondent, wrote an article for CIA News called CIA-trained Ukrainian paramilitaries may take central role if Russia invades in the disputed territories. And that the CIA was overseeing a secret intensive training program inside the United States for elite Ukrainian special forces and other intelligence personnel. And this came from 5 former intelligence and national security officials who were familiar with the initiative and familiar with Zach Dorfman. The program started in the immediate onset after the Revolution of Dignity. And in the months prior after that, the training facilities inside the United States were somewhere in the southern U.S., in which the CIA began training ultra right-wing separatist groups and the military in this very extensive training program. Also in that year of 2015, the United States took the Azov battalion off the terrorist watch list. And so now, with the Azov battalion off the terrorist watch list, they basically could have funding from the United States government. And this is not a conspiracy, what I'm telling you. This is documented fact. And it came from the House unanimously adopted a bipartisan amendment, HR 2685, which was called the Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2015. And one of the adopted bipartisan amendments specifically blocked training of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi group Azov Battalion. And Representative John Conyers and Ted Yoho, Democrats, sponsored the amendment of the bill, which was passed unanimously by Congress. In addition to criteria established in that amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which was originally sponsored by Senator Patrick Leahy, which was known as the Leahy vetting process that I talked about earlier. Well, the Leahy process consisted of screening foreign forces applying for U.S. government training and support to certify that they haven't committed any gross human rights violations. And if they are found to have done so, support is withheld. But the problematic truth is that the United States currently has no real way of ensuring that neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion are not being trained by U.S. forces because they haven't committed a gross human rights violation up until that point. But now they have. And you could see them on YouTube and other viral media, where they're actually killing Ukrainian civilians who are suspected of being Russian spies or who are not supporting these ultra-separatist right-wing ideologies. And, you know, Dorfman would later write that in 2015, as part of the expanded anti-Russia effort, it was the CIA's ground branch paramilitaries who then went to Ukraine and started traveling to the Eastern Front to advise the counterparts, like the Azov Battalion and these right-wing groups. And the program that was running here in the Southwest United States included training in firearms, camouflage techniques, land navigation, intelligence. And even though U.S. officials denied that the CIA training program was ever offensively oriented, in which it was, one defense official told Dorfman, quote, "The purpose of the training and the training that was delivered was to assist in the collection of intelligence," end quote. Not to mention the training of guerrilla warfare. And now it's expanded to sending billions of dollars to these groups and to the military in a conflict that was instigated by the United States anyway. So this is not the first time where the CIA has basically tried to overthrow a government in a coup. We've seen it throughout the 1970s in Latin America. We've seen it as far back as 1953 with Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. We've seen it tried in Iraq in 1990. And of course, we've seen it happen in Syria, which is one of the worst violations, one of the gross violations of the United States government in supporting right-wing groups. In this instance, in 2011, it was called Operation Timber Sycamore, in which the United States government, during the war on terror under the Obama administration, started sending military aid and training to Salafi groups. And according to them, non-affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And how would you know? All these Salafi jihadist groups basically intertwined with each other. And we're sending millions of dollars in aid, as well as Saudi Arabia, who became involved, and Turkey, in which the operation was designed by none other than CIA Director David Petraeus, influenced by none other than King Abdullah of Jordan and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, to help with the coup of Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
Welcome back to the News Hub here at WSJ Live. I'm Simon Constable. The CIA is moving weapons in a bid to arm Syrian rebels as the U.S. plan to aid Assad's foes takes shape. Here with WSJ exclusive is Wall Street Journal Pentagon correspondent Adam Enthouse. And there is Washington. Thank you, Adam, for being there. This, as I will emphasize again, is an exclusive. The arms are moving in. Tell us what's happening.
Well, what we've learned from diplomatic sources is that the CIA had been stocking up on Soviet-era weapons, including Kalashnikov ammunition and anti-tank weapons. And they've begun, over a period of the last week or so, moving that stockpile to Jordan to position it for what they expect to be a very intense training and vetting program, where for a period of 2 weeks they will work with small groups of 10 to 20 rebels to ensure that they meet U.S. standards and that they know how to use the weapons. And then they will begin to move into Syria, probably in the late July or early August timeframe.
Okay. Now, one of the things that they're also doing is there's going to be a no-fly zone or a partial no-fly zone, not across the whole of Syria. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that is a proposal that was made by Pentagon war planners because they felt that it would be necessary to provide some protection to the CIA operatives and also other personnel that would be involved in this arming and training program. However, that program, that idea of a no-fly zone is not moving forward at this time. It ran into considerable opposition within the White House, which is still hasn't ruled it out and could decide to look that way. But at this point, what the White House has given the CIA permission to do is to begin the arming process.
Now, one of the worries that some people have about the arming process is that these arms will end up in our enemies' hands, and we're not talking about the Assad forces or forces loyal to Assad, but folks that are linked with Al Qaeda. This vetting process, it's got to be somewhat risky, hasn't it? You know, showing up and giving arms, and then it goes into the battlefield, and you don't really know where it's going to go, do you?
Right. Well, certainly this was the main reason why President Obama nixed this exact same proposal last year when it was presented to him. They were very concerned that Islamists would be able to get some of these weapons, particularly the more heavy weapons that could be used against tanks or, for example, anti-aircraft man-pads that can be used against aircraft. What's changed, according to administration officials, is that the CIA has a much better handle on who's who within the rebel opposition forces. And that's given them increasing confidence to go forward. But in many ways, what you're seeing here is a shift in strategy by the Obama administration that reflects a recognition of the changes that have occurred on the ground, where you have a resurgent Assad and an increasing number of Hezbollah fighters in Syria that have tipped the balance of the fight. And now the administration fears that the rebels could lose Aleppo in the coming months.
It sounds like it's going to get rather interesting over there. We appreciate your time, Adam Enter.
And so what we have is a history of the CIA training these ultra-nationalists, ultra-orthodox groups in the hopes of overthrowing democratically elected governments, in which you will see a repetitious cycle of conflict and war. You know, George Orwell once wrote in 1984 that war was not meant to be won, it was meant to be continuous. And for those who are wearing the Ukrainian flags, who are defending this conflict, that you will have to come to the understanding that there is no evil here. There is no good here. There is no good side. There is only evil. There's only nefarious intentions at play. And the United States government is at the head of that table. We're the ones who commit the most wars. We're the ones who allow the CIA to instigate conflicts in the hopes of interfering in elections abroad. We're the ones who give billions of dollars in aid to these ghoulish, ultra-separatist, ultra-orthodox groups who later will be, who at the time will become an ally and later become an enemy. It is the United States who lies to you every single day about this conflict and about other instances of past history. And if you just stopped and just took a look and just glossed over the information I provided you here today, you'll have a better understanding of what this conflict was basically all about. And it wasn't about Ukrainian freedom. It's costing their freedom. The United States will pour billions of dollars more into this conflict, even at the behest of Ukrainian lives. They're not the ones calling for a peace talk. Other countries are, but the United States is not, because what they want is an escalation. And if this war fails on its merits, or if it's not gaining momentum in the public sphere, well, then we can always move on to China or Iran. And we'll use the right to do that. And the neocons that are with the left will move over to the right. Question your vote. Question who you support. And if you really value human life, you will join the rest of the people at the Libertarian Institute, people like Scott Horton and Kyle Anzalone and Patrick McFarlane and Connor Freeman and Will Porter and Dave DeCamp and other libertarians like Dave Smith and Reed Coverdale, Clint Russell, Angela McArdle, who are trying to tell you through viral media to help them in the call for no war anywhere and put a stop to this madness once and for all, because we value human life and we value peace and hegemony, and we are not going to get it with either the Democrats or Republicans. Don't be silent. Speak out. And I know I always, it sounds like I'm being very aggressive and anal regarding, I want you to see more of my followers make videos or written content. Well, now's the time. We're at the precipice of maybe a nuclear war. I mean, that it's not too out of the far reaches. I mean, we're right there. Well, your voice counts. And stop going with this left and right narrative. It's a failure. It's only meant to divide us and not unite us. So speak out and support anti-war and antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.